You probably think Daniel Plainview was driven by greed. You are entirely wrong. Money was never his goal, it was his weapon. He didn't want to be rich, he simply wanted everyone else to lose. We mistake his story for a tragedy of extreme capitalism, but beneath the tailored suit was a feral predator who rented an orphaned infant to swindle farmers, executed a man in the dirt, and casually caved in a priest's skull with a bowling pin. Plainview didn't conquer the American dream to build a legacy. He bought the entire world for one terrifying reason, so he could finally lock the door and be absolutely alone. The descent into pure, unadulterated avarice does not announce itself with a gunshot or a sudden act of physical violence. It arrives through the quiet, methodical commercialization of the most fundamental human bonds. For a predator operating within a structured societal framework, brute force is inefficient and highly conspicuous. A more insidious strategy is required to bypass the natural defenses of a community holding valuable resources. The psychological manipulation of deeply held cultural values becomes the primary and most devastating weapon of choice. To extract wealth from insular frontier communities, a solitary predator must bypass their natural suspicion of outsiders. The acquisition of an orphaned child serves this exact tactical purpose. Presented as a widowed father, the operator deploys the boy as a psychological Trojan horse, instantly neutralizing the landowner's inherent defenses. The child's mere physical presence, a living prop, does the heavy lifting of establishing fabricated virtue, carefully positioned to distract the marks from the ruthless, extractive entity sitting across the negotiating table. Maintaining this elaborate camouflage requires a staggering amount of sustained cognitive control. The operator must project warmth, familial devotion, and vulnerability, while simultaneously running ruthless predatory calculations behind his eyes. Every pat on the child's head or gentle word spoken in public must be meticulously calibrated for its specific audience. There is no room for genuine emotion, as genuine emotion is unpredictable and cannot be perfectly monetized or controlled. The internal state of the man is completely, deliberately divorced from his external performance. This persistent emotional counterfeiting permanently damages the operator's capacity for any authentic human connection. When a man spends his days weaponizing the aesthetics of love, the actual experience of love becomes entirely alien to him. He aggressively trains his brain to view all human interaction through a strictly transactional and adversarial matrix. Empathy is no longer recognized as a natural human reflex. It is merely a tool to be picked up and discarded as the situation demands. The complex psychological architecture required to sustain this lie slowly hollows out the individual from the inside. The most severe psychological consequence of this strategy is the literal quantification of a human soul. When a child's presence is directly correlated to the successful acquisition of land at a fraction of its value, a terrifying threshold is crossed. The boy's worth is no longer intrinsic or inherent to his humanity. It is explicitly tied to the profit margins of the acquired leases. He is functionally reduced to a line item on a ledger, a depreciating asset whose value fluctuates based on his utility in the field. This marks the total collapse of whatever moral framework the operator may have once possessed. This paradigm shift fundamentally reconfigures the predator's entire universe. If the sacred bond of fatherhood can be commodified and deployed as a bargaining chip, then absolutely no human relationship is safe from the marketplace. Everyone encountered from this point forward is instantly assessed for their potential utility or their potential threat to the operation. The world ceases to be a community of individuals and becomes a vast, complex mechanism of leverage, extraction, and dominance. The operator has successfully isolated himself within a psychological prison of his own cynical design. The tragedy of this deceptive strategy extends far beyond the financial ruin of the unsuspecting landowners. It inflicts profound, irreversible psychological damage on the child who has been drafted into this charade. The boy is silently conscripted into a lifelong confidence game without his consent, comprehension, or ability to object. He is raised in an environment where affection is entirely performative, creating a deeply unstable foundation for his own mental development. The child implicitly learns that his primary function is to facilitate the ambitions and mask the cruelty of his guardian. The specific environment of the early oil boom provides the perfect psychological petri dish for this type of sociopathic adaptation. It is a landscape defined by rapid, chaotic wealth extraction, where traditional moral frameworks are frequently suspended in the frantic pursuit of capital. The sheer scale of the potential profit encourages men to rationalize increasingly extreme and dehumanizing behaviors. In a world where the earth itself is being violently violated for its resources, the exploitation of a child seems like a minor necessary transgression. The ruthless environment actively validates the operator's internal corruption. This validation creates a highly dangerous and self-sustaining feedback loop within the predator's psyche. Every successful acquisition, every lease secured through the manipulation of the family man image reinforces the perceived utility of the deception. The immense financial rewards act as continuous positive reinforcement for his sociopathic detachment from the human race. He becomes rigidly convinced that his methodology is not only highly effective, but intellectually superior to the sentimental weakness of his competitors. He views his total lack of genuine attachment as a vital evolutionary advantage in a brutal, uncompromising ecosystem. The target landowners, in their fundamental decency, are completely unequipped to identify this specific strain of psychological predation. Their worldview is structured around the core assumption that certain social conventions, like paternal devotion, are immutable facts of nature. They simply cannot fathom a mind that would meticulously counterfeit such a sacred bond solely for financial leverage. This massive cognitive blind spot is precisely the vulnerability that the operator identifies and relentlessly exploits. He is weaponizing their own inherent goodness and social trust against them. By trusting the fabricated facade, the landowners become unwitting participants in their own economic and geographical subjugation. They sign away their generational wealth and autonomy, falsely believing they are entering into a mutually beneficial partnership with a kindred spirit. The psychological shock of the eventual betrayal is amplified exponentially by the realization of how deeply they were manipulated. They realized they were not merely outmaneuvered in a business transaction, but violated on a profoundly personal and spiritual level. The predator does not just siphon their oil. He actively makes a mockery of their core moral values. The lie of the family man quickly becomes a demanding parasite. Plainview exists completely surrounded by people, the laborers he commands, the landowners he swindles, and the child he employs as a prop. Yet he views them strictly as kinetic objects in his orbit. Every interaction is a calculation. Every smile is a heavily monitored data point. This state of perpetual calculated deceit subjects his nervous system to chronic stress. The impenetrable fortress of wealth he builds functions flawlessly as a tomb, and the sheer mental exhaustion of maintaining this hypervigilant reality inevitably begins to fracture his psychological stability. Eventually, the boundary between the fabricated persona and the genuine self begins to dangerously erode. The operator spends so much time analyzing and manipulating the emotions of others that he loses contact with his own internal compass. He can no longer differentiate between a strategic choice and a genuine desire, as every impulse has been filtered through the lens of profit. The child, originally acquired as a simple tool, becomes a permanent, unavoidable mirror reflecting the operator's complete lack of a soul. The presence of the boy is a constant, irritating reminder of the lie that serves as the foundation of his empire. To escape this psychological discomfort, the operator must double down on his emotional detachment, pushing the child further away internally while maintaining the physical proximity required for the illusion. He begins to view the boy not just as a tool, but as a silent, oppressive witness to his daily moral failings. The affection he forces himself to display becomes increasingly strained, hollow, and difficult to manufacture on demand. The initial utility of the child is slowly eclipsed by the psychological burden of having to pretend to care for him. The carefully constructed prop is slowly transforming into a suffocating psychological liability. The architectural foundation of an impenetrable psychological fortress is rarely poured in moments of comfort or community. It is forged in the absolute, terrifying absence of a safety net, where the illusion of human solidarity is violently stripped away. To comprehend the complete eradication of vulnerability within a human mind, one must examine the neurological impact of profound, isolated physical trauma. The genesis of this specific pathology is located at the bottom of a dark, unforgiving hole in the earth. The shattered leg in the silver mine is not merely a physical injury. It is the brutal, dividing line of an entire existential worldview. When a human being is severely compromised in an environment utterly devoid of assistance, the brain undergoes a radical, irreversible rewiring process. The darkness of the shaft acts as a sensory deprivation chamber, forcing the mind to confront the terrifying reality of its own fragility. In that agonizing silence, the concept of a benevolent universe or a protective society is permanently shattered. There is no rescue party, no divine intervention, and no sympathetic ear to hear the screams. Survival in this abyss depends entirely on a vicious, uncompromising mobilization of personal will. Dragging a broken body across miles of desolate, unpopulated terrain is an act of defiance that fundamentally alters a man's relationship with his own species. The agonizing crawl to civilization teaches a permanent, unforgiving lesson about the true nature of existence. It dictates that every breath, every inch of progress, and every heartbeat is a solitary victory won against a hostile environment. This level of sustained physical agony burns away any lingering sentimental attachments to the concept of mutual aid. The survivor emerges from the dust not with gratitude, but with a cold-hardened contempt for the fragility of the human condition. This traumatic rebirth establishes extreme self-reliance not as a preference, but as a rigid biological imperative. The memory of vulnerability in the pit creates a permanent state of psychological hypervigilance. To rely on another human being is to recreate the conditions of that original helplessness, a prospect the traumatized brain simply cannot tolerate. Therefore, the absolute rejection of assistance becomes the highest moral virtue in this new, solitary belief system. The survivor convinces himself that any form of dependency is a direct precursor to death. The physical limp that remains long after the bones have healed serves as a constant rhythmic reminder of this foundational philosophy. It is a physical manifestation of the price paid for survival, an internal metronome ticking off the dangers of a hostile world. Every step taken with that slight irregularity reinforces the conviction that the earth is not a home, but a battlefield. The injury is perversely cherished as a badge of honor, proof of an elite resilience that separates him from the softer masses. It is the physical proof that he requires absolutely no one to sustain his existence. This radical philosophy rapidly metastasizes into a pathological, all-consuming isolationism that dictates every subsequent interaction. The external world is no longer perceived as a community of peers engaging in shared social contracts. It is strictly viewed as an untamed wilderness, populated entirely by competitors, predators, or prey. The men surrounding him are not colleagues or neighbors, they are merely temporary variables in his ongoing equation of survival. The concept of an egalitarian relationship is simply impossible to process within this adversarial framework. To maintain dominance in this perceived wilderness, the individual must actively suppress any instinct toward camaraderie or collective action. Participating in a group requires compromise, and compromise is viewed as a fatal concession of personal power. The solitary operator views the herd mentality of towns and congregations with deep intellectual disgust. He sees their collective structures not as strength, but as a pooling of shared weaknesses designed to protect the incompetent. By entirely removing himself from this social fabric, he believes he is ascending to a higher apex position on the evolutionary ladder. This absolute refusal to integrate creates a unique psychological paradox regarding the accumulation of capital. Wealth is not pursued for the traditional purposes of securing luxury, achieving social status, or ensuring familial comfort. It is aggressively hoarded as the ultimate defensive mechanism, a vast insurmountable wall built to keep the rest of humanity at bay. The relentless drive to extract resources is fueled by the need to guarantee total, unquestioned autonomy. Capital is simply the ammunition required to wage a preemptive war against the possibility of ever being dependent again. Every acre of land acquired and every competitor crushed serves to thicken the psychological armor surrounding the operator. He systematically buys out the surrounding territory to enforce a literal and figurative buffer zone between himself and the world. Driven by profound paranoia, the expansion of the enterprise serves only to build a wider buffer zone against humanity. If he owns the earth beneath their feet, he controls the fundamental parameters of their existence, thereby neutralizing any threat they might pose. His business strategy is indistinguishable from a military campaign of total subjugation. The sheer scale of this ambition requires the enlistment of laborers, creating a volatile dynamic for a man who despises dependency. He must command vast teams of men to extract the wealth he requires, yet he holds them in absolute contempt. He views his workforce as an extension of his own machinery, biological tools to be utilized and discarded when their efficiency drops. He cannot view them as individuals with their own intrinsic value, because doing so would violate his core tenet of isolation. Managing this workforce becomes an exercise in applying maximum pressure while maintaining zero emotional investment. The inability to delegate meaningful authority is a direct consequence of this fractured worldview. Delegation requires a foundational level of trust, an assumption that another human being can execute a task with competence and loyalty. For the traumatized survivor, extending trust is equivalent to handing a loaded weapon to an enemy. He must personally oversee every critical calculation, every negotiation, and every operational decision. This micromanagement is exhausting, but the anxiety of relinquishing control is infinitely more terrifying to his nervous system. This relentless need for control creates an incredibly narrow and suffocating psychological landscape. The mind becomes a locked room, completely sealed off from the influx of new ideas, alternative perspectives, or stabilizing outside influences. When a man believes he is the only competent, rational actor in the universe, his own biases and internal logic go completely unchallenged. The absence of external validation or critique accelerates the deviation from standard human morality. He becomes the sole author, judge, and jury of his own reality. This self-imposed exile from the human race ensures a profound and inescapable loneliness. Though it is a loneliness he actively defends, he cannot acknowledge the pain of his isolation, because that would be an admission of a deeply human need. Instead, he aggressively frames his solitude as a conscious choice, a marker of his superiority over those who require the warmth of the crowd. He wraps his loneliness in a cloak of intellectual arrogance, convincing himself that he is simply too complex and driven to be understood. This rationalization is a vital defense mechanism, protecting his ego from the terrifying void he has created. The hostility he projects outward is fundamentally a reflection of the brutal, unforgiving standards he applies to himself. He extends no grace, no forgiveness, and no understanding to others, because he permits none for his own perceived failures. The internal monologue is a constant punishing drill sergeant, demanding absolute perfection and total dominance in every endeavor. The concept of rest or satisfaction is viewed as a dangerous lapse in vigilance, an invitation for the world to strike. This internal tyranny guarantees that his success will never yield any psychological dividend. As the physical empire expands, the internal psychological space simultaneously contracts, growing darker and more severe. The very traits that ensured his survival in the desert, ruthlessness, suspicion, and singular focus, become deeply maladaptive in a functioning society. He possesses no alternative emotional gears to shift into when the immediate threat of physical death is removed. He treats a standard contract negotiation with the same life or death intensity as the crawl from the collapsed mine shaft. This inability to modulate his responses makes him a highly effective predator, but a profoundly broken human being. The tragedy of this condition lies in the complete irreversibility of the psychological transformation. Once the brain has fully integrated this adversarial, hypervigilant framework, the pathways to normal human connection are permanently severed. He cannot simply choose to trust someone or open himself up to genuine camaraderie. as his neurological wiring physically rebels against the concept. He is locked into a trajectory of increasing isolation and paranoia, driven by an engine of trauma that he cannot turn off. The survival instinct, once a saving grace, has become a terminal, incurable disease. The perception of other men strictly as obstacles or prey fundamentally alters the execution of violence and coercion. When an opponent is stripped of his humanity and viewed merely as a logistical problem, moral hesitation is completely eliminated. The destruction of a rival's livelihood or the exploitation of a vulnerable community is executed with cold, mathematical precision. There is no malice in these acts, only the mechanical efficiency of a system designed to eliminate friction and maximize control. This detachment is far more dangerous than passionate hatred, as it is entirely immune to appeals for mercy or fairness. His interactions with authority figures or established societal structures are marked by a deep, seething resentment. He views laws, regulations, and social norms as artificial constructs designed to restrain the strong and protect the weak. Having survived outside the boundaries of civilization, he feels entirely unbound by its arbitrary rules and polite fictions. He complies with societal structures only when it serves his immediate tactical purposes, viewing the legal system merely as another landscape to be conquered. His internal morality operates entirely on the primitive law of the frontier, where power is the only recognized currency. The total absence of spiritual or philosophical anchors further accelerates this descent into pure nihilism. He possesses no belief system beyond the tangible accumulation of dirt, rock, and the dark liquid beneath it. Without a higher purpose or a sense of duty to a larger community, his actions are entirely unmoored from ethical considerations. The earth is not a creation to be stewarded. It is an opponent to be violently broken and drained. This aggressive materialism serves as a hollow substitute for the spiritual connection he is incapable of experiencing. This intense focus on the physical extraction of value leaves him entirely blind to the intangible costs of his methodology. He cannot calculate the price of a ruined reputation, a shattered community, or the complete loss of his own soul, because these things have no market value. His internal ledger only records acreage, barrel yields, and capital dominance, completely ignoring the massive accumulation of psychological debt. He operates under the delusion that he can outrun the consequences of his actions as long as his wealth continues to multiply. He fails to understand that the void inside him is expanding faster than his ability to fill it with currency. The few individuals who attempt to penetrate this fortress, whether out of genuine curiosity or shared ambition, are swiftly repelled. Any attempt to forge a peer-level connection is instantly analyzed for hidden motives or potential leverage. He assumes that anyone offering friendship or loyalty is simply running a more sophisticated con than the average competitor. This reflexive suspicion ensures that his inner circle remains completely empty, save for the sycophants and paid laborers who pose no intellectual threat. He demands absolute submission from his associates, ensuring that he is never challenged or forced to consider a contrary perspective. The resulting echo chamber amplifies his darkest impulses and confirms his most cynical biases about human nature. When a man interacts exclusively with those he has purchased or intimidated, he receives a highly distorted reflection of reality. He sees only greed, fear, and submission, entirely confirming his belief that these are the only true motivators of the human animal. This confirmation bias hardens his resolve, convincing him that his ruthless methodology is perfectly aligned with the natural order of the world. He becomes entirely consumed by the very darkness he believes he is mastering. Ultimately, the fortress designed to protect him from the vulnerability of the mine shaft becomes an exact replica of it. He is once again trapped in a dark, isolated space, entirely cut off from the warmth and light of human connection. The only difference is that the walls of this new prison are constructed of capital, paranoia, and the destroyed lives of his competitors. The survival instinct has perfectly executed its primary directive, ensuring his physical existence at the absolute cost of his humanity. He stands victorious at the apex of the food chain, the most powerful and fundamentally broken entity in the landscape. The architecture of a carefully constructed psychological facade can withstand years of gradual wear, but it instantly shatters under the sudden application of extreme, unexpected pressure. A catastrophic event does not create a man's core priorities. It brutally exposes them by stripping away the luxury of conscious calculation. In the exact fraction of a second, when an environment violently destabilizes, the human brain bypasses all artificial social conditioning and defaults to its truest baseline. For a predator who has spent a decade curating a benevolent public image, an industrial disaster acts as a ruthless, instantaneous audit of his soul. The ensuing chaos leaves absolutely no mental bandwidth to maintain the performance of the devoted family man. When the earth violently ruptures, discharging its pressurized contents into the sky, the true object of the operator's worship is finally illuminated by the fires of the disaster. The sensory overload of a catastrophic blowout, the deafening roar, the chaotic destruction of machinery, the immediate threat to human life, would compel a functional human being to immediately seek out their vulnerable dependents. Yet, in the presence of overwhelming physical danger, the operator's neurological response is entirely inverted. His attention is not violently pulled toward the screaming, bleeding child who has just suffered a permanently life-altering trauma. Instead, his gaze is irresistibly magnetized upward, locked onto the towering geyser of black crude raining down upon the landscape. This visual fixation is the ultimate, undeniable proof of a completely severed human conscience. The child's sudden agony registers merely as background noise, an incidental disruption to the glorious, terrifying validation of the operator's own supreme ego. The oil erupting from the ground is not merely a commodity, it is the physical manifestation of his dominance over nature, his competitors, and the universe itself. The terrifying smile that breaks across his face, illuminated by the hellish glow of the burning derrick, is a reaction of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. In this singular moment, the material wealth entirely eclipses the biological life, confirming that the boy was never a son, but merely a temporary passenger in a much larger, darker ambition. The child's sudden deafness introduces a catastrophic variable into a previously efficient system. A profoundly disabled boy demands genuine, unscripted empathy, a psychological capacity the operator systematically eradicated within himself during his ascent to power. Confronted with a trauma that cannot be managed through calculated charm or capital, the child transforms from a useful asset into a suffocating liability. The operator views the boy's silent distress not as a tragedy to be soothed, but as a deliberate sabotage of his hard-won victory. Consequently, the decision to place the boy on a train is not a medical intervention, but a brutal act of psychological amputation. By physically removing the child, the operator eliminates the only remaining mirror reflecting his profound emotional bankruptcy. As the train pulls away, he does not experience the agonizing grief of a severed familial bond. Instead, he experiences the intoxicating, terrifying rush of complete moral liberation. The removal of the child marks a permanent and fatal shift in the operator's relationship with the rest of society. He has officially crossed the Rubicon, willingly destroying his only link to the concept of familial responsibility and generational continuity. The elaborate, exhausting mask of the dedicated father is permanently dropped, left behind on the station platform alongside the discarded boy. He no longer needs the protection of a socially acceptable persona because his financial leverage has achieved critical mass. The sheer scale of his capital now provides its own impenetrable gravity, warping the social fabric around him and rendering public opinion entirely irrelevant. Without the child to anchor him to a baseline of recognizable human behavior, his descent into pure sociopathy accelerates without any internal resistance. The last remaining guardrails of social convention are completely dismantled, replaced by the primitive, uncompromising mathematics of total domination. He is now a free agent in the most terrifying sense of the word, unburdened by guilt, unhindered by empathy, and completely numb to the suffering of others. The energy previously expended on maintaining the illusion of humanity is now entirely redirected into the aggressive expansion of his empire. The freezing of his compassion is complete, leaving behind a highly functioning, ruthlessly efficient void. This total emotional zero point alters the very nature of how he conducts his future aggressions against his rivals. He no longer needs to justify his predatory actions through the lens of providing for a family or securing a legacy for an heir. The acquisition of wealth is stripped of all its traditional, socially palatable rationalizations. He crushes competitors not to ensure his family's survival, but simply because the act of crushing them provides the only remaining stimulation his deadened nervous system can register. The cruelty becomes the entire point of the exercise, a mechanical reflex devoid of any deeper philosophical meaning. The absence of the child also removes any theoretical limitation on the operator's acceptable collateral damage. When a man has actively chosen to discard his own flesh and blood for the sake of convenience, the destruction of strangers becomes laughably inconsequential. He begins to view entire communities, landscapes, and local economies purely as consumable resources to be drained and discarded at will. The ethical boundaries that govern standard human commerce are completely invisible to him. He operates under the terrifying logic of a localized black hole, consuming all surrounding matter simply because it is in his nature to do so. This absolute isolation, however, does not bring the peace or satisfaction he subconsciously expected when he removed the burden of the child. The silence left in the boy's wake is not a comfortable quiet, but a heavy, oppressive vacuum that slowly begins to crush the operator's psyche. He has successfully eliminated all external emotional demands, yet he finds himself completely trapped within the suffocating confines of his own paranoia. There is no one left to trust, no one left to confide in, and no one left to witness his terrifying ascent. The complete lack of human friction leaves him dangerously ungrounded, floating aimlessly in a cold, dark universe entirely of his own making. He attempts to fill this agonizing void with an even more frantic, aggressive pursuit of material expansion. The pace of his operations becomes manic, a desperate attempt to drown out the internal silence with the roar of heavy machinery and the influx of capital. But the psychological math is fundamentally flawed. The accumulation of finite resources cannot cure an infinite emotional deficit. Every new well drilled and every new competitor bankrupted only serves to highlight the terrifying emptiness at the core of his existence. He is starving to death while actively hoarding the largest feast in human history. The tragedy of this specific phase of his deterioration is that the operator is entirely aware of his own monstrous transformation. He does not suffer from delusions regarding his own morality. He possesses a cold, clinical understanding of exactly what he has become. He knows that his reaction to the accident was inhuman, and he knows that the abandonment of the child was an act of unforgivable cowardice. This profound self-awareness is the true source of his internal agony, a constant low-level hum of self-loathing that he can never fully suppress. He hates the world for being weak, but he hates himself far more for being entirely devoid of a soul. This localized self-loathing manifests in a volatile, deeply unpredictable hostility directed at anyone who attempts to bridge the emotional distance he has established. Any display of genuine affection or concern from an external party is immediately perceived as a patronizing insult or a covert manipulation. He attacks those who try to understand him because their empathy highlights the very capacity he permanently destroyed within himself. He demands absolute submission and compliance from his environment, ensuring that no one ever gets close enough to see the festering psychological wound left by the absent child. He actively constructs a reality so hostile and toxic that no healthy human emotion could possibly survive within it. Ultimately, the fire at the derrick did not just burn away the physical structure of the drill, it incinerated the last remaining theoretical possibility of the operator's redemption. The ashes left behind offer no fertile ground for new growth, only a sterile, toxic landscape where nothing of value can ever take root again. He has successfully traded his only chance at a genuine human connection for a subterranean ocean of black liquid. He is now completely, irreversibly committed to the dark path he has chosen, a solitary predator prowling the edges of a society he entirely despises. The freezing of his compassion is no longer a temporary survival tactic. It is his permanent, irreversible state of being. The architecture of absolute isolation is inherently unstable, heavily reliant on a continuous suppression of fundamental human biology. Even the most rigorously conditioned predator harbors a dormant microscopic vulnerability, a deeply repressed instinct that craves recognition from a peer. The arrival of a man claiming shared ancestry bypasses the industrialist's formidable defensive perimeter precisely because it targets this specific starved psychological nerve. The predator allows this foreign entity into his heavily guarded inner sanctum, temporarily suspending his usual intense paranoia. He makes this unprecedented exception because the crushing, silent weight of his self-imposed exile has momentarily exceeded his capacity to endure it. This sudden tolerance for proximity is not a genuine step toward rehabilitation or emotional recovery. It is a highly specific, desperate search for an intellectual equal, a mirror reflecting his own profound misanthropy. He desperately requires validation that his hostile worldview is not merely a personal pathology but a shared genetic trait. By bringing the supposed sibling into the fold, he seeks to normalize his own toxicity. He wants to look across the fire and see an ally who inherently understands the necessity of viewing the rest of the world as prey. The resulting confession delivered in the darkness is a clinical, terrifying autopsy of a dying soul, performed voluntarily by the patient himself. When he admits that he sees absolutely nothing worth liking in other people, he is not seeking comfort or requesting psychological intervention. He is delivering a formal, unrepentant declaration of permanent ideological war against the entire human species. He has rigorously evaluated the population through the heavily distorted lens of his own trauma and found it fundamentally bankrupt. This vocalization is a necessary release of internal pressure, a rare moment of absolute horrifying honesty regarding his own internal decay. This confession also reveals a chilling degree of self-awareness that contradicts any assumption of blind, unthinking greed. He clearly articulates the existence of the competitive hatred burning inside him, recognizing it as a destructive, undeniable force. He understands that his ambition is not driven by a desire to build, but by a pathological need to ensure no one else succeeds. This is the tragic core of his condition. He possesses a brilliant analytical mind perfectly capable of diagnosing his own sociopathy, yet he lacks the emotional machinery or the basic desire to initiate any form of psychological correction. The subsequent revelation that the confidant is a fabricated identity triggers a catastrophic and immediate psychological collapse. The imposter's lie essentially tricked the predator into exposing his most heavily guarded vulnerability to a complete stranger. The ensuing violence is far too visceral and intimate to be categorized as mere retaliation for a financial deception or trespassing. It is an act of frantic, violent self-correction, an attempt to aggressively seal the breach in his emotional armor with physical force. By executing the imposter, he is permanently punishing the universe for daring to offer him the false promise of a genuine connection. Disposing of the body in the dirt serves as a profound literal manifestation of burying his final tether to the human race. He methodically covers up the evidence of his own fleeting weakness, ensuring that no physical trace of that specific vulnerability survives. He emerges from the woods completely purged of the desire for peerage, brotherhood, or mutual understanding. The psychological slate has been violently wiped clean, leaving absolutely no fertile ground for future emotional infiltration. He has successfully sterilized his internal environment, rendering it utterly uninhabitable for any form of human affection or trust. With familial connections eradicated, the industrialist's hostility narrows onto the local preacher. They are identical apex predators harvesting the same vulnerable community, one extracting tangible oil, the other extracting intangible faith. The industrialist views this spiritual exploitation not as a competing theology, but as a direct, insulting challenge to his own monopoly on power. The ensuing war of attrition is designed to empirically prove that the dollar absolutely supersedes the divine. Even his submission to a public baptism is devoid of contrition. It is a meticulously calculated, deeply cynical transaction to secure pipeline rights, proving his terrifying capacity to weaponize his own humiliation for long-term strategic dominance. The passage of time solidifies the industrialist's victory, effectively neutralizing all external threats and cementing his position at the apex of the hierarchy. However, the complete absence of adversity creates a dangerous psychological vacuum for a mind entirely structured around combat and survival. Without competitors to crush or territory to conquer, the aggressive energy that fueled his ascent has nowhere productive to manifest. He becomes marooned in his own massive success, isolated within an empire that requires only passive maintenance rather than active warfare. This lack of external friction forces him to turn his destructive impulses entirely inward, accelerating his physical and mental deterioration. The final confrontation occurs in an environment completely divorced from the natural world, perfectly reflecting the industrialist's terminal psychological state. The private, subterranean recreational space is a sterile arena designed exclusively for his own solitary amusement, devoid of natural light or external influence. The preacher arrives completely stripped of his flock, his financial security, and his artificial moral superiority. He is desperate, broken, and actively seeking salvation from the very man who orchestrated his systematic disenfranchisement. The power dynamic is entirely asymmetrical, setting the stage not for a negotiation, but for a psychological execution. The metaphor of the consumed beverage deployed during this final exchange is a masterclass in articulating pure, predatory economic theory. The concept of draining another man's vessel from across the room perfectly encapsulates the horror of invisible systemic capital extraction. It illustrates a methodology of absolute dominance that does not require physical proximity, mutual consent, or even the victim's awareness. The industrialist has siphoned the lifeblood of his rival's territory from entirely beneath his feet, leaving the surface untouched but completely hollowed out. It is the ultimate capitalist insult, revealing that the victim was financially exsanguinated while he firmly believed he was standing on solid, unbreached ground. This revelation is designed to inflict maximum psychological trauma before any physical violence is initiated. The industrialist wants the preacher to fully comprehend the absolute futility of his existence and the complete failure of his spiritual worldview. He systematically dismantles the preacher's last remaining illusion of agency, proving that his faith provided absolutely zero protection against superior capital strategy. The goal is to induce a state of total despair, ensuring the victim recognizes the exact mechanism of his own destruction. The industrialist is not just taking the man's dignity, he is meticulously erasing his entire history of perceived influence. Before administering the final physical blow, the predator demands a complete and total ideological surrender from his cornered prey, forcing the preacher to loudly proclaim himself a false prophet is the primary essential objective of this entire confrontation. The physical destruction of the man is entirely secondary to the complete annihilation of his foundational belief system. The industrialist requires this vocal admission to definitively validate his own lifelong rejection of spiritual or moral frameworks. Hearing the preacher abandon his God provides the ultimate terrifying vindication for the industrialist's own strictly godless materialist existence. The use of the wooden sporting equipment to crush the preacher's skull represents a profound deviation from the industrialist's standard operating procedure. Historically, His violence and aggression were strictly utilized to secure operational advantage, eliminate friction, or protect his capital investments. This final act of unhinged violence, however, yields absolutely zero financial dividend or strategic benefit for the massive corporate empire he has built. The oil is already secure, the land is thoroughly drained, and the rival was already entirely neutralized. This violence is an act of pure, unrestrained pathology, a violent release of decades of accumulated psychological toxicity. This final execution does not resolve the industrialist's internal agony. It merely finalizes his complete detachment from human reality. The destruction of the false prophet is the final necessary ritual required to crown himself the singular, undisputed deity of his own desolate universe. He has systematically eliminated every external variable, every competitor, and every potential source of human connection. The psychological war against humanity has concluded with a decisive, overwhelming victory for the predator. Yet, the absolute silence that follows the violence is not the sound of triumph, but the terrifying acoustics of an empty tomb. In his final years, the predator's geographical landscape fatally contracts from the infinite western frontier into a heavily fortified private estate. This sprawling mansion is not a celebration of wealth, but an architectural manifestation of clinical paranoia. Having neutralized all external threats, the aggressive machinery of his ambition is left idling in the dark, forcing his intellect to violently cannibalize itself. He subsidizes this somatic decay with an industrial-grade consumption of alcohol, a chemical necessity to silence the punishing internal monologue of a man who won the world but despises his prize. He ultimately retreats to a subterranean bowling alley, a sterile, acoustically sealed bunker, where he is trapped in an infinite loop of mechanized, simulated conquest against wooden pins, expending his final energy on an utterly pointless exercise. The final breach of this isolation occurs when H.W. returns as an autonomous adult seeking economic independence. To the operator's pathological narcissism, the boy's self-actualization is not a paternal triumph, but an intolerable violation of the natural order. Unable to subjugate the young man through financial leverage, he deploys maximum psychological violence. He targets the fundamental core of H.W.'s identity by weaponizing his orphan status. By branding him a bastard from a basket, the industrialist retroactively erases their shared history, reducing decades of life together to a fraudulent business transaction. This linguistic execution is a dual-purpose strike. It inflicts paralyzing isolation on the victim, while serving as a final surgical cauterization of the operator's own soul. By viciously burning his last human bridge, he ensures no future vulnerability can ever take root, achieving the absolute terrifying purity of his isolationist doctrine. The departure of H.W. finalizes the absolute emotional vacuum of the industrialist's existence. He has systematically eradicated every source of connection, rivalry, or affection. The complex world of human interaction has been reduced to a static binary: isolation and control. Without the presence of an opposing force, his massive intellect begins to rapidly lose its cohesion. The engine of his ambition, lacking external targets, turns inward and consumes its own infrastructure. When the final confrontation occurs in the windowless bowling alley, it is merely the mechanical twitch of a dying predator. "I'm finished," he mutters beside the evidence of his final collapse. It is not a statement of a completed ambition, but a clinical diagnosis of a terminal existential condition. The biological organism will continue to metabolize, but the consciousness has effectively flatlined. The absolute pursuit of dominant extraction did not yield a king. It produced a hollow machine. The empire of steel and oil will outlast his physical body, standing as a permanent monument to the methodical eradication of his own soul. He built his own hell, assumed the throne, and locked the gates from the inside.